On July 25, 2026, the European Union passed its 21st sanctions package against Russia, and the headlines treated it as a victory. CNN said, the EU was tightening the vice on Moscow. The BBC called it the most decisive action Brussels has ever taken. 50 more ships were added to the blacklist, and the oil price cap was maintained. It all sounds impressive, but almost nobody read the fine print. Buried deep inside a document running to hundreds of pages is a single clause that changes everything. EU member states are permitted to sell Russian oil seized from sanctioned vessels into their own domestic markets. This is not a sanctions package. It is the European Union legally buying Russian oil under a different name, and no major outlet is talking about it. That clause is only the first layer. Peel it back and you find the United States quietly considering a special forces raid on Iranian nuclear facilities that Iran has already booby-trapped in anticipation. You find that Iran has drawn up a new target list inside Israel, made up of sites that cannot be repaired or rebuilt for years. A list that activates automatically if America strikes Pickaxe Mountain, even without Israeli participation. And you find Iran's foreign ministry using Hannah Arendt's own philosophical language to dismantle the European Union's moral credibility in front of the world. Before the numbers, one concept: the self-destroying loop. When an empire is declining, it creates policies that look strong on the surface but make it weaker underneath. Solving problem A creates problem B. Solving B creates a bigger problem C. The cycle continues until the whole structure collapses under its own weight. Picture a man running from the rain who takes shelter in a house that's flooding, climbs onto a roof that's rotting. Every escape move puts him in a worse position. That is what is happening to the United States right now, and it can be traced step by step. America attacks Iran on February 28, 2026, in Operation Epic Fury, officially to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons, but really to break up a forming Russia-China-Iran axis and protect the petrodollar system. Iran responds by blockading the Strait of Hormuz, 25% of the world's seaborne oil and 20% of its seaborne LNG blocked, and Brent crude jumps to $126 a barrel. The energy shock slams into Europe, hitting Germany hardest since it already lost cheap Russian gas after 2022 and is now losing Middle Eastern oil too. Europe needs energy immediately, and the only country with oil to sell is Russia, so Europe buys it, sanctions package or not, through channels it won't publicly acknowledge. Then Ukraine, backed by Washington, strikes Russian oil infrastructure, and Russia responds by extending its fuel export ban through the end of 2026. Tightening global supply and making Europe even more desperate for Russian oil. The loop closes. America attacks Iran, Europe runs short on energy, Europe buys Russian oil, Russia grows stronger, American alliances fracture, America feels pressure to prove its strength and attacks Iran harder, and the cycle repeats. The sanctions package itself is the clearest example. On the surface it looks tough. 50 ships blacklisted, the 4.10 per barrel price cap held. But buried in the legal text is a mechanism allowing member states to sell oil seized from sanctioned Russian tankers into their own domestic markets. It's the equivalent of someone declaring they've quit smoking while adding the caveat that they're still allowed to smoke any cigarettes someone else hands them. A legal excuse to keep doing exactly what they were already doing, while still claiming to have quit. And there's a number that proves this predates the new package entirely. From January to April 2026, 4 months before Package 21 existed, the EU imported Russian LNG from the Yamal Arctic project worth £3 billion, 98% of that project's entire output. The EU wasn't just tolerating Russian energy in the shadows, it was keeping an entire sanctioned project alive. Package 21 didn't create this behavior. It legalized behavior that was already happening. Then there's the incident that captures the absurdity of the whole loop. On July 25th, a tanker chartered by Chevron, carrying Kazakh oil through the Caspian Pipeline Consortium route across the Black Sea, the very route Washington built specifically to let Europe reduce its dependence on Russian energy, was struck by a Ukrainian drone. Chevron called Washington, and the Trump administration had to call Zelensky and ask Ukraine to stop hitting non-Russian ships in the Black Sea. America is fighting Iran to protect Europe's energy supply lines, while America's own ally is destroying the alternative supply route with drones, forcing Washington to reprimand its own partner to protect an American company's oil shipment. There's also a single sentence this week that deserves more attention than it's getting. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman, responding to EU foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas's human rights concerns, said the EU cannot claim to champion human rights while providing logistical and technical support for lethal attacks on Iranian civilians and infrastructure, while offering no sympathy for Iranian children killed by American and Israeli bombs. He described the EU's position using the phrase, "the banality of evil," a direct borrowing of Hannah Arendt's term for the Nazi bureaucrats who enabled the Holocaust, not out of monstrous cruelty, but through simple bureaucratic indifference, following procedures, signing documents, attending meetings while people died. Iran is making the identical accusation against the EU, an institution that isn't an active villain, just one that keeps signing agreements and issuing statements while civilians die from bombs launched off bases on European territory. Combined with the EU legalizing Russian oil purchases while lecturing Iran on human rights, and providing basing support for American strikes while refusing to join the naval coalition, that one phrase becomes a precision strike on European credibility in front of the roughly 4 billion people in the global south watching this conflict. The real winner in all of this isn't the United States or Iran, it's Russia. Not one Russian soldier has died in the Persian Gulf. Not one Russian aircraft has flown over the Middle East. Yet the Hormuz blockade has pushed oil prices to levels generating enormous revenue for Moscow at zero additional military cost. For comparison, Iran, the country being bombed nightly, still earned $18 billion from oil sales during the conflict. $11.5 billion during the active war phase, $6.5 billion during the ceasefire window. More than 60% of its entire annual budget's projected oil revenue, despite a full naval blockade. If Iran can manage that under bombardment, Russia's position under no bombardment at all is far stronger. And on July 25th, Putin extended Russia's fuel export ban through the end of 2026, officially to stabilize domestic supply after Ukrainian strikes on the Tuapse refinery in Siberia and the Filanovsky drilling platform in the Caspian. But the practical effect is less fuel on the global market, higher prices, and more European desperation to seize and resell Russian tankers under Package 21. Russia squeezes Europe from behind, while Europe shoots itself in the foot from the front. And Moscow is the only party that benefits. A less covered thread involves Kuwait and Bahrain. Over the weekend of July 24th, 25th, the Wall Street Journal reported that both countries secretly sent fighter jets to strike Iranian territory in early July. Kuwait's emir publicly denied authorizing any use of Kuwaiti land, airspace, or waters for action against Iran. And Kuwait's ambassador to the U.S. called the report baseless. So who conducted the strikes? Think of Kuwait as a house. The homeowner, the Kuwaiti government, says it authorized nothing. But American forces stationed at Ali al-Salem Air Base, Camp Arifjan, Camp Doha, and Camp Buehring are tenants operating under Washington's orders, not the homeowners. Iran doesn't distinguish between the two. Iranian Armed Forces spokesman General Abdulrahim Mousavi stated this week that Iran's retaliatory operations targeted U.S. bases in Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain, some of the most important American installations in the region, putting the surrounding territory, not just the bases, at the center of the response. Kuwaiti civilians are absorbing the consequences of a war their government never joined, launched from their own soil by forces they don't control, raising the question of whether that arrangement is an alliance or something closer to an occupation. The strongest opposing argument deserves a fair hearing before it's addressed. It holds that the EU is still genuinely sanctioning Russia. Package 21 still blacklists 50 ships and keeps the price cap in place. That the Kuwait story rests on unconfirmed intelligence. That the pause in U.S. airstrikes is real evidence of a diplomatic push. And that America has substantially degraded Iran's military, destroying its navy and roughly 250 fighter jets, which counts as one of the most successful degradation campaigns in decades. That argument has real merit in places. Legally, Package 21 remains a sanctions package, and Europe's workarounds are understandable in a crisis of this scale. But it doesn't explain why a mechanism that lets states seize and resell Russian tankers creates an incentive to seize more tankers, turning a temporary workaround into a permanent parallel import channel running alongside the official embargo. It doesn't explain the £3 billion in Yamal LNG imported before Package 21 even existed, proving the behavior predates and isn't caused by the new rules. And it doesn't explain Senator Tim Sheehy growing emotional on the Senate floor over a friend killed by an Iranian bomb and vowing to finish the war, which shows Trump can't easily exit even if he wanted to, or Spain refusing U.S. access to Rota and Marone, Germany, Italy, and Spain refusing to join the Hormuz naval coalition, France refusing the Gaza peace initiative, and Trump threatening 200% tariffs on French and Spanish wine in response. Those aren't signs of a functioning alliance. They're signs of one disintegrating in slow motion. On the military degradation claim specifically, what the CIA is privately telling the White House looks very different from the public messaging. Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane reportedly raised urgent concerns at a Friday White House meeting about the rapid depletion of Patriot interceptors at U.S. Central Command, confirmed by the New York Times, with the Pentagon acknowledging operations are on hold and quietly revising the U.S. death count from 18 confirmed fatalities down to 14. This isn't a miscount, it's information management. 3 American soldiers died in Jordan when an Iranian strike breached the defensive perimeter, and after 13 consecutive nights of bombing, the Patriot stockpile is critically low, meaning the diplomatic pause reads more like a logistics pause. Washington is weighing 3 options, each carrying its own danger. Netanyahu is pushing Trump toward ground forces and seizing positions on the Iranian coast, with Trump reportedly considering a strike larger than any so far. Iran's army spokesman General Shekarchi said this week that any American withdrawal is conditional on Israel's permission, meaning Israel effectively holds the lock on the exit door. And a classified CIA assessment reportedly estimates Iran's ballistic missile program is still about 70% intact after months of strikes, with satellite imagery cited by Fox News and former Defense Secretary Esper suggesting Iran is actively rebuilding its missile and drone programs, using Chinese satellite data to locate U.S. Patriot and THAAD batteries, and exhausting interceptor stockpiles with cheap drone swarms before launching real ballistic missiles into the gaps. Iran's IRGC claims it destroyed 11 American aircraft at regional bases between July 8th and 22nd, including an F-15 in a hardened shelter, a P-8, a C-17, and 8 refueling tankers. Claims the U.S. hasn't confirmed, but also hasn't denied. A ground invasion faces the added problems of Iran's size and terrain, the Zagros and Alborz mountain ranges, deserts, and dense cities separated by huge distances that would stretch any invading force's supply lines. Plus the reality that foreign boots on Iranian soil tend to unite a divided population against the invader rather than as liberators, risking a guerrilla resistance worse than Iraq or Afghanistan, given a larger, better-armed opponent that has been preparing for this scenario for years. If a full invasion is too costly, a more targeted option is reportedly on the table. The New York Post reported Washington is weighing a large-scale special operations mission to seize enriched uranium directly from Iranian facilities, requiring thousands of troops to secure sites, clear booby traps, and protect transport routes, with a smaller specialized team retrieving the material itself, something one expert called potentially the most sophisticated operation in military history. The sites under consideration include Isfahan, Fordow, and Pickaxe Mountain, the underground complex near Natanz built into solid rock, one of Iran's most fortified and still expanding installations. Iran already knows this option exists and has reportedly reinforced the sites and planted explosives in anticipation of exactly this kind of raid. Meaning America would be considering one of the most complex special forces operations ever attempted against a target where the defender is already waiting with booby traps in place. Perhaps the most significant piece is the least covered. An Iranian security source told Al Jazeera this week that Iran has drawn up a new target list inside Israel. Not standard military sites, but infrastructure that could not be repaired or rebuilt for years. Power systems, water networks, financial architecture. The kind of targets that would leave Israel functionally unviable as a modern state for an extended period. With the source adding that striking them would accelerate emigration from Israel. A direct statement about long-term demographic survival. The structural mechanism is what makes this dangerous. The list activates even if Israel does not directly participate in any U.S. strike on Pickaxe Mountain. If America strikes that target unilaterally, Iran responds against Israel regardless. Israel is forced to retaliate, and the U.S. is pulled into simultaneous conflict with Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, and Iranian forces all triggering together. General Mousavi made explicit this week that U.S. bases in Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain sit at the center of Iranian retaliatory planning, meaning every country hosting American military infrastructure in the region is a potential target in the next escalation cycle. The ceasefire, in other words, isn't peace, it's a reloading pause, with 3 available options, each carrying a worse downside than the last, and Iran having already built a tripwire that turns any strike on Pickaxe Mountain into a regional war, whether Washington wants one or not. There's also a legal front, with no explosions or drones, but real consequences for long-term American credibility, where Iran is using international law itself as a weapon. On July 25th, Ukraine struck 2 Iranian commercial vessels in the Caspian Sea, the Port Olya 2 and the Bagheri, killing 1 sailor. Ukraine says the ships carried military cargo for Russia. Iran invoked Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, the prohibition on attacking civilian vessels, and demanded Security Council action against Ukraine, a genuine trap, since condemning Ukraine, a Western ally, would shatter NATO's narrative that Russia is the sole aggressor, while staying silent hands Iran proof that the UN only condemns America's adversaries, regardless of facts. The precedent already exists. Security Council Resolution 2817, passed in March 2026, condemned Iran's retaliatory strikes on Gulf states without a single word about the American and Israeli strikes on Iran and Lebanon that provoked them, condemning the response while ignoring the provocation, which Iran calls censorship and, from a strict legal standpoint, has a real argument for. The IAEA front runs in parallel. After weeks of American bombing, the agency requested access to inspect Iran's nuclear facilities, and Iran refused, with nuclear chief Mohammad Islami arguing Iran won't allow inspections until the IAEA establishes clear post-war protections for internationally safeguarded facilities and formally condemns the American strikes on Iran's civilian nuclear infrastructure, essentially arguing that an institution can't demand compliance with rules it stayed silent about when someone else broke them. Iran's broader objective is to strip the neutral label from both the UN and IAEA in front of the global South, and every instance of uneven enforcement advances that argument without a shot fired. All of this connects to something larger than oil prices or sanctions text, the structural foundation of American global power, which rests less on aircraft carriers than on the US dollar and the alliance system that sustains demand for it, the petrodollar system, in which oil must be purchased in dollars. Look at what's happening to that foundation. The EU importing Russian LNG through channels that route around the dollar, Kuwait publicly disavowing military action conducted from its own soil, Spain denying US base access, Germany refusing the Hormuz coalition, France refusing the Gaza initiative, and Iran's foreign minister meeting Russia's Lavrov and China's Wang Yi at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in Kyrgyzstan the same week, building what Lavrov described as a regional security mechanism with no American center. These aren't isolated cracks, they're systematic fractures in the foundation the petrodollar stands on. America attacked Iran partly to protect that system. But the attack is pushing allies toward energy independence from American-controlled supply chains, parallel financial structures, and alternative security arrangements, all of which undermine the very system the attack was meant to defend. 3 things are worth watching over the next 2 weeks. First, the Patriot stockpile. If the US transfers air defense systems from South Korea or European NATO bases to the Middle East, that signals the tactical pause is ending and a new escalation cycle is coming. If no such transfer appears within 2 weeks, Washington is likely leaning toward an Omani-mediated diplomatic exit. Second, Israel and the Iranian target list. If Israel continues operations in Lebanon and Gaza while Washington claims to be negotiating, and Iran's language about irreparable infrastructure targets grows more specific, that's the Pickaxe Mountain tripwire being prepared for activation. Third, the Security Council's response to the Caspian attack. Silence on Ukraine's strike on those Iranian vessels would give Iran fresh evidence to present to the African Union, ASEAN, the SCO, and the Arab League that international institutions operate on a double standard, strengthening its position with the roughly 4 billion people outside the Western alliance. Worth reading directly, the full legal text of EU Sanctions Package 21 and its clause on seized vessel oil, UN Security Council Resolution 2817 from March 2026, and its asymmetric language on Iranian retaliation versus the strikes that provoked it, and the New York Post report on the proposed Special Forces uranium operation. Taken together, the EU sanctioning Russia with one hand while buying its oil with the other, an American ally using drones against the alternative pipeline the US built to replace Russian oil, a tactical pause dressed as diplomacy while the Patriot stockpile runs dry, special forces being weighed against an already booby-trapped target, and a single strike on a mountain in Iran capable of automatically triggering a regional war that pulls in Israel regardless of what Washington wants. The real question isn't who's winning on the battlefield, it's who is actually in control of how this ends.